fired!
No, you're fired.
I'll never win Blossom Queen without my movie.
Sure, it's not too late to change documentary subjects, right? I chose Dylan as my documentary subject because I wanted to make something real.
Geek Charming.
Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain and welcome to the DCOM review. After multiple requests from too many people to name, we're finally taking a closer look at Geek Charming. 2011 was a pretty good year for DCOMs, with Lemonade Mouth and Across the Second Dimension also coming out that year. But does this movie hold its own against those heavy hitters? Well, let's find out as we dive into Geek Charming. We start things off in an unusual place, the perspective of the most popular girl in school, Dylan Schoenfield, portrayed by Modern Family star Sarah Hyland, whose main objective is to win Blossom Queen at the upcoming spring formal. It seems like just another normal day in the life of teenage popularity until who else but our male lead proceeds to dump food on her. But then, the movie backs up to better inform us of what happened right before. That's an odd technique. The movie literally rewinds just to replay that scene. But why did director Jeffrey Hornaday decide to edit it like that? Keep that in mind for later. Our lead male is Josh Rosen, portrayed by High School Musical 3 co-star Matt Prokop. He's the president of the film club and is trying to make a movie so that he can win the Puget Sound Film Festival. The only problem is, he doesn't really have a great topic. That is, until he decides to create what he calls a hard-hitting expose on popularity by making Dylan the topic of his documentary. Dylan is naturally captivated by the opportunity to be a movie star, something that her competition for Blossom Queen wouldn't be able to match, so she agrees. In the aftermath of that, the film goes to a dark place and the way it's filmed and captured really shows some nice attention to detail. The wide shots of Dylan all by herself in a big house are meant to symbolize how alone she sometimes feels, ever since her mother died. And we later learn that her mother was Blossom Queen a generation ago, so winning it has some actual meaning, as opposed to the normal slate of popular girls we get in these movies who don't have terribly clear objectives other than causing problems for the main character. Now, here's the question to ask yourself. We the audience know the real reason Blossom Queen means so much to Dylan, but do her friends? Following that, we get a handful of moments where Josh is filming his movie and trying to figure out who the real Dylan is, but that's proving to be a challenge. She takes Josh shopping, makes a boatload of head-scratching comments, and is obsessed with the most standard jock you could ever imagine in Asher. Everything about her screams diva, even though Dylan herself really doesn't like that title. But an earlier part of the movie already established that this isn't the entire picture, so why isn't that what's shining through to this point? We'll talk about that in detail when we get to the character analysis. Getting back to the plot, Dylan and Josh argue over whose movie it actually is, which leads to a fight and someone being fired. That part isn't really clear. But the plot point, of course, doesn't last very long because if Josh and Dylan didn't make up, we wouldn't have much of a movie. Both this movie and the movie that they happen to be making. So Dylan goes to a film club event where they show Flight of the Navigator, which is a solid movie by the way, I would recommend it, but in any case, after that, Dylan invites Josh to hang out with her, and through those moments, Josh starts to learn what we the audience already know about Dylan to some degree. It's rare that DCOMs have scenes where the characters talk directly to people watching, but because of how this movie works, it's a technique that functions pretty well, in addition to the fact that they use it sparingly, and it never feels like it takes too much away from the events within the movie itself. So now we finally get to the second major plot point in this movie, that being Dylan's attempt to recreate Josh by changing his look completely. Josh likes the way he looks, but because he's starting to develop feelings for Dylan, he acquiesces to her wishes. So, of course, because this movie is called Geek Charming, the geek in question wears new clothes, new shoes, and gets a new haircut, and suddenly becomes charming, in something of an in-movie social experiment where girls that never noticed Josh before are suddenly infatuated by him now. But with all that time he's been spending with Dylan, Josh continues to push his other friends aside, and they are none too happy about that. Now, here's something I didn't like about the movie. They kept trying to force this Josh-Amy infatuation, but when they eventually did date, they made that scene as blunt as possible. It's one thing to not have a lot in common, but what are the chances that literally everything that could go wrong does go wrong on their first date? This film could have benefited from a bit more subtlety on that end, because we basically expect Josh and Dylan to eventually end up together, so they don't have to go overboard with establishing Amy as the less ideal choice. But I do like the fact that Amy was made into the kind of character who understands that Josh actually does have feelings for Dylan, and doesn't try to force anything on her end. In the aftermath of Asher's party, Asher breaks up with Dylan and everything is starting to go awry for her. The way it happens is interesting because as Dylan spends more and more time with Josh, she slowly reveals more of her real self, which, in turn, creates a situation where who she's becoming is not in harmony with the popular persona she's been building, which then leads to all of her fallouts with the other popular students. So after some hurdles, Josh finally finishes his movie. The movie does the relatively standard misunderstanding trick, where the movie starts off as one thing, then Dylan runs away before the movie becomes the real thing. It would have been a pretty plain movie cliche, but here's why it's actually phenomenal. Now, stay with me on this one, guys. This seemingly simple plot point actually symbolizes something very deep. Geek Charming as a movie isn't really about making this geek a more charming person. That's only a secondary plot point. This movie is all about Dylan as a character, and eventually dispelling the notion that she's only a popular diva. Josh making this hard-hitting expose about popularity is symbolic of the entire movie itself. This movie is about the movie within a movie that is actually the movie. Let's unpackage that a bit more. The movie Josh starts making portrays Dylan as just another diva, just like so many popular girls from so many DCOMs. We see them everywhere. But as Josh's movie progresses, we get to see more of Dylan, the real Dylan, and that's exactly the same as Geek Charming itself. Geek Charming as a movie is all about the making of Geek Charming, which inherently is about a popular girl becoming more than just the stereotypical diva that everybody knows and probably dislikes. Even the crowd at the movie festival is symbolic of us, the audience. They start off mocking Dylan, which is exactly what I did the first few minutes of the movie, but when the onlookers learn more about her, she becomes even more popular than before. This is an insanely brilliant narrative construction, a movie that is almost self-aware of the high school cliches that partially define it, and how overused they are in other films as well, namely popular girls that tend to serve as the antagonists in other movies. Director Jeffrey Hornaday subverts this cliche by making the popular girl the main character and actually allowing her to develop. Getting back to the last bit of plot, we finally get to the spring formal. Why? Because every DCOM has its dance, so we find out earlier that Josh wins the film festival, and later on, Dylan, of course, wins Blossom Queen. Even in the closing moments of the film, both Dylan and Josh understand that this is a movie, so they end with a light jab directed at sequels as their characters discuss the possibility of Geek Charming 2, which, of course, as we know, didn't happen. And now, the characters. There's not too much to say about most of the supporting cast. The whole point of this movie is that those characters are supposed to be flat, because when you don't have a lot of space to develop characters, they never really change. And with most movies with mean popular girls, they wouldn't change either. But this movie understands that there's more to those people than what is normally seen, and as I mentioned, that's not just the entire point of Geek Charming, but the entire point of Josh's movie within Geek Charming. But hey, Artie's in this movie, so there's that. So, let's get right to the main duo. The way they relate to each other as two people from two very different worlds reminds me of the dynamic they tried and somewhat failed to pull off with Starstruck. But the difference is, I think Josh and Dylan as characters are very believable in their roles, and the way they play off each other works really well, especially when they gradually grow more comfortable with each other. Matt Prokop as Josh does a pretty solid job in this movie. His character is kind of like Scott from Lemonade Mouth, except a film nerd. I personally love the fact that a film nerd is a main character in a DCOM, because as some of you know, I'm a film nerd myself. The secondary storyline of turning him into a more popular version of himself functions well as a counter-parallel to what Dylan is going through in terms of both of them slowly changing into the characters that they both become by the end of the film. A smart thing this movie also does is not abruptly changing Josh back into what he was before the film began just because he started blowing off his friends. This works because both characters become more complete people at the end of the movie and learn to value someone who has also been going through their own changes. But, as I mentioned, this isn't primarily what this movie is all about. And that brings us to Sarah Hyland as Dylan. I love Modern Family, but I didn't watch it before watching this movie. Geek Charming convinced me that I should. Sarah is exceptional as Dylan, which has a lot to do with how she's constructed. Remember how I asked if her friends knew about why she really wanted to be Blossom Queen? Most of you would probably say no, and most of you would probably be right. The entire point of her character is to present a version of herself that symbolizes everything popular. The shopping, the shoes, the obsession with French, all things we've seen in divas before, but that's not the real her, or at least not the complete her. The real her was left behind when she came into high school because she wanted to be popular. Dylan, just like many people, see popularity as the definitive high standard, but doesn't actually understand it all that well. She assumes that popularity in high school follows you, but it doesn't. She assumes dating popular guys like Asher automatically makes her and said popular guy a perfect couple, but they're not. But that's not to say that popular kids are always bad. We just spent an entire movie with one that isn't, and that's the whole point. If her friends, or even Asher himself, were actually developed and the movie was made to look more closely at them as people, they wouldn't be pigeonholed as just airhead popular kids either. But at the end of the day, Sarah Hyland does well as Dylan because she does well as both a standard popular girl and as a complete person. In a lot of ways, it's similar to Radio Rebel, but in reverse, because Dylan is also slowly becoming the person she was always meant to be, and Sarah does well to approach that, while also making the more human moments engaging. And that's Geek Charming. So, what's the verdict? Geek Charming is an unbelievably intelligent, very meta narrative that knows exactly what it wants to be and what it wants to do, both of the cliches they use and the cliches they change. There's a lot of weird editing and a lot of moments you can either take or leave, and the supporting cast doesn't really leave too much of an impression. Again, that just might be the point, but it doesn't change what's on the screen. Geek Charming is a very good movie that has a lot of serious things to say about movies similar to it and how they subject mean girls to the antagonist role, while rarely learning why they are who they are and why they belittle and bully others. Dylan's character works well in this type of narrative because even when she's being a diva, she's never overly off-putting, which makes her transition more viable than it would be for some other Disney mean girls we've seen over the years. I felt that the writing, which works in some areas but can be a bit bland at times, really keeps this movie from ascending towards true greatness. Jeffrey Hornaday as a director is great with narrative construction and concepts, and both are on full display in Geek Charming. But this film was not without its flaws. He did, however, get a solid acting performance out of Matt Prokop and an even better performance out of Sarah Hyland. Their acting, combined with the genius way this movie within a movie is built, and how they subvert the mean girl cliche for the sake of a film that focuses and develops said mean girl are all huge positives. It's so very fitting that a movie starring a film geek would look to tackle such an interesting and unique idea. If you aren't as into the meta-narrative, this movie might not fascinate you as much as it does me. But even beyond that, I think there's a lot to like about it, so it definitely gets a resounding recommendation from me. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, go ahead and throw down a like, sub for more, and share it all over social media. And don't forget to follow the Disney Brain on Facebook and Twitter for updates, links down below. The next video will finally be the Boy Meets World review you guys have been asking about, followed by the next Liv and Maddie review, and then we'll be diving into the top 10 best Nickelodeon theme songs, so plenty to look forward to. Until then...
All of high school trying to get rid of the real me. There's some ground rules. No filming from my left side. I need a beauty budget.
Are you always this high maintenance?